The storm had swallowed the entire valley of Aspen long before sunset, turning the sky into a swirling curtain of white that pressed against the tall windows of Whitmore Estate like a living creature. Clara Bennett had never seen snow behave this way in her life. Back in Montana, storms were loud and wild, but they always felt like something she could name. This one felt like a presence, something ancient and watchful breathing against the walls of the massive house. The lights flickered twice, the way they had been doing throughout the evening, but this time they did not return. The chandelier dimmed, sputtered, and finally surrendered to the darkness. The generators should have kicked in, but they stayed stubbornly silent. The house became a shadowed cathedral of expensive silence, with only the wind howling through the pine trees outside. Clara stood in the hallway holding a folded blanket, listening. At first, she thought the sound she heard was the storm shifting in the rafters, but then it came again. A sharp crack, something breaking, something inside the house. She froze. No one else should have been awake. The estate staff had left early because of the storm, security had retreated to the gatehouse, and Julian Whitmore, the man who owned everything within these walls, had not left his private quarters all day. Clara swallowed hard. That sound had come from the west wing, from the room the staff whispered about, the one Julian had forbidden anyone to enter, the one he had sealed off as if it were a vault that held his entire life. The room of memories, the room of ghosts. She should have turned away, should have gone back to the kitchen or waited for the lights to return. But something in that second crack, sharper and more desperate than the first, tore through her caution. Clara walked down the hallway, each step slow and careful, her slippers making no sound on the imported wood floors. The storm groaned above her like a grieving animal. When she reached the door to the forbidden room, she hesitated, her breath fogged in the cold air. The handle looked darker than the door, almost black, as if touched 1,000 times by regret. Another sound came, not a crack this time, but a gasp, and she knew. Someone was in there, someone who should not be alone. Her fingers closed around the handle before she could convince herself not to. The door opened with a soft click. The room smelled of smoke. Not fire, but paper burning slowly, the way one might destroy pieces of a life in small, angry breaths. Clara stepped inside. The air was warmer here, heavy with the weight of something she could not name. Then she saw him. Julian Whitmore, the billionaire whose photograph appeared in every business magazine, the man who moved markets and built companies, and whose signature could shift the future of entire industries, was sitting on the floor like a man who had lost everything. He was surrounded by photographs strewn across the carpet. Some were burned along the edges, curled like dried leaves. Others were untouched but trembling in the faint draft coming from the window he must have cracked open earlier. They were all pictures of him. Younger, stronger, sunlight in his hair, muscle in his shoulders, promise in his eyes. Clara felt something in her chest twist. Julian looked nothing like the man in those photographs now. His face, though still handsome, carried exhaustion the way other men carried scars. His shoulders, once proud and athletic, were drawn inward as if years of grief had folded him into himself. He held one last photograph in his hand, the edges already browning from the flame of the lighter that rested beside him. His eyes did not lift even when she stepped closer. He seemed unaware of anything except the image he was breathing toward, as though trying to erase it with his despair. Clara whispered his name. It was the first time she had ever spoken it aloud. Usually she addressed him as Mr. Whitmore with the respectful distance expected of a maid, but something about this moment stripped away the boundaries of their roles. His head lifted slowly, as though the weight of his memories made the motion painful. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as if he was looking not at Clara but through her. A heartbeat passed before recognition settled into his features. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and low, a sound cracked by sorrow. "Do you know what it feels like to be old while the world keeps calling you powerful?" Clara stepped forward without thinking. Her instinct was not fear or confusion, but something deeper, something tender that rose from an instinct she could not explain. She knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the soft carpet. The storm raged outside, but inside the room everything felt suspended. He let the photo slip from his fingers, and it drifted downward like a wounded bird. His shoulders trembled. Clara reached out, hesitating only a second before placing a gentle hand on his arm. His muscles tightened under her touch, not in anger but in vulnerability. He met her eyes fully now, and she saw a man unraveling. Not the billionaire, not the legend. Just a man who had forgotten how to live. The lighter rolled away as his hand weakened. Then, without warning, his body leaned toward her. His forehead touched her shoulder. His breath shuddered against her. Clara steadied him with both arms, her heartbeat thundering. She had never held a man this way before. Never been this close to another human being who was breaking and trusting her to keep the pieces from falling. Julian exhaled a sound that was neither word nor cry but something caught between surrender and exhaustion. His weight shifted into her more fully, and then he collapsed gently into her arms. She caught him, a billionaire undone by a storm, and the ghosts he had tried to burn, a maid holding a man the world believed unbreakable. The snow outside intensified, beating against the window, as if trying to witness the moment that would change both their lives. Clara tightened her hold on him, feeling the warmth of his breath at her collarbone, and knew with a clarity that shook her that nothing in her quiet world would ever be the same again. The morning after the storm, Aspen awakened beneath a sky so clear it felt almost unreal, as though the night had never happened, as though the world itself had conspired to hide the truth of what had taken place inside the private room of Whitmore Estate. But for Julian Whitmore nothing felt clear, nothing felt cleansed. The moment he opened his eyes in his own bed, with the unfamiliar sensation of having been carried there, rather than arriving under his own strength, he knew something inside him had shifted. He lay still for a long time, staring at the exposed wooden beams above him, listening to the faint hum of the heating system that had finally come back online. Normally, he rose before dawn, disciplined even in his melancholy, but today his body felt weighted not with exhaustion but with memory. The image of Clara kneeling beside him refused to fade. Her touch, her steady breathing, the quiet courage in her eyes when she spoke his name. He had not let anyone near him like that in years, not since the accident that destroyed the bright young future the world had predicted for him, long before the empire, long before the money, long before the grief that calcified into something colder than pain. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat upright, staring at the framed photograph on the nightstand. It was the last picture taken of him before everything went wrong. 24 years old, radiant with certainty, wearing the number that had once represented every dream he had ever held. He remembered the way people used to look at him back then. Promise was a kind of armor, it made him invincible. Or so he believed. The fall had changed everything. One mistake on the slopes, one patch of invisible ice, one moment where gravity decided to rewrite his life. The doctors told him he was lucky to survive, lucky to walk, lucky to breathe. They did not understand that survival can sometimes feel like punishment. His dreams ended that day, and he had been forced to replace them with something colder, something more calculated. His father pushed him into the business world with the same ruthless ambition he once admired in Julian's athletic life. By 27, he had taken over Whitmore Innovations, the medical technology company that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. He built it higher than anyone expected. He made it global. He made it powerful. But in the quiet hours when no one watched, he knew the truth. Power feels like nothing when the heart no longer beats for anything. Then came the second blow, the one that completed the work the accident had begun. His wife, Elena, gentle and brilliant, gone in a surgery that was supposed to save her. He remembered sitting in the hospital hallway staring at the walls as though they were speaking a language he no longer understood. People approached him with condolences that sounded like hollow bells. He felt nothing. Nothing except the slow breaking of something deep inside him that refused to die, completely choosing instead to ache for years. People said he handled the loss with grace. They did not know he simply stopped letting anyone in. A man cannot be hurt if he chooses to become unreachable. For years that strategy worked. He attended meetings, made ruthless decisions, wore tailored suits, signed contracts that shaped the future of entire medical sectors. Everything about him looked intact from the outside. But the truth was simpler. He stopped living. He ate because he had to, slept because exhaustion forced him, worked because it was the only place where feeling nothing was acceptable. And then there was the board, the vultures who circled in expensive suits, men and women who whispered that Julian was losing his edge, that his grief had turned into weakness, that Whitmore Innovations needed a leader who wanted the future rather than someone trapped in the past. Among them, the loudest voice belonged to Victoria Hale, the daughter of a family that had intertwined their political and financial influence with the Whitmores for decades. She had once been proposed as a suitable partner for Julian after Elena died, a union that would merge 2 dynasties. He had declined, respectfully, firmly, and Victoria had never forgiven him. The media buzzed with her name. The investors adored her. The board saw her as the natural successor. She saw Julian as something else entirely. An obstacle, and obstacles were meant to be removed. The pressure had been building for months. He could feel the board tightening their expectations around him like a noose. He could see the news articles speculating about his declining public appearances. He could hear the murmurs that perhaps he was no longer the brilliant mind he once was, all of it carved into him piece by piece, until even his reflection looked like a stranger. The only place he truly belonged anymore was the room Clara had found him in. The room of memories he could not bear yet could not destroy completely. It held everything he used to be and everything he had tried to forget. He avoided that room except on nights when the past dragged him back, nights when the storm outside matched the storm inside him. Last night had been one of those nights, but unlike every other time, before he had not faced it alone. For reasons he could not explain, Clara's presence had not felt like intrusion. It had felt like relief, as if someone had found him drowning and chosen not to walk away. Now he wondered what she must be thinking, whether she would avoid him out of embarrassment or worse, pity. He rose from the bed and dressed mechanically, pulling on a crisp shirt and dark trousers, as though preparing to face another day of board demands and investor anxieties. But something in him knew the day would be different. Something in him knew he could not simply return to the rhythm of numbness. Clara had seen too much, and he had felt too much. When he stepped into the hallway, he paused. The staff had returned. The noise of normal life resumed. But the moment he saw Clara at the far end of the corridor, holding a stack of folded towels, her eyes briefly lifting to meet his, Julian felt a thud in his chest that reminded him painfully of what it meant to still be human. She looked away quickly, cheeks warming, but the memory of her arms around him lingered like a quiet flame. For the first time in years, Julian Whitmore feared something. He feared wanting to live again. Clara Bennett had always believed that goodness was not something complicated or extraordinary, but something woven quietly into the choices a person made each day, the small moments where kindness could breathe even when the world felt sharp and demanding. Growing up in a small Montana town that barely appeared on state maps, she had learned early that life rarely gave people what they wished for, but often revealed who they truly were, through loss, responsibility, and the way they treated others when no one was watching. Her mother, a woman whose strength never faltered even as illness began to shape her days, had raised Clara with gentle wisdom. She taught her that faith was not simply a matter of religion but a matter of how one chose to see people, how one chose to remain soft even when life tried to turn them hard. It was her mother who told her that love was not something to rush into, that the heart was not meant to be handed out freely but offered to someone who proved they knew how to hold it. Clara took those words seriously, maybe too seriously, as her friends liked to tease her while they stumbled in and out of brief romances that never seemed to last. They said she was old-fashioned, too careful, too romantic in a world that had no patience for innocence. Clara did not see herself as innocent. She saw herself as someone who understood value, and to her the most valuable thing she possessed was her heart. She had no intention of giving it away lightly. Her virginity was not something she spoke about because it was not something she wore like a badge or guarded with fear. It was simply a part of her story, a quiet detail in a life where she had been too busy working double shifts, studying and helping her mother to worry about dating or discovering the kind of intimacy she read about in novels. Men in her town rarely noticed her anyway. She was the girl who helped at the diner, the girl who walked home carrying groceries, the girl who disappeared into the background, because she had no desire to be anything more than what she already was. Moving to Aspen had not been a dream but a necessity. Her mother's medical bills grew more demanding every month, and the quiet jobs in Montana could not compete with the wages offered by wealthy families in need of responsible live-in staff. Clara had been recommended through a friend of a friend, and before she could second-guess herself, she was boarding a bus that took her across the mountains, into a world she had only ever seen in magazines. Whitmore Estate was intimidating at first glance, a sprawling architectural masterpiece, surrounded by tall evergreens and winding snow-kissed paths, a place that looked more like a private retreat than a home. Clara remembered the first time she stepped through its doors, clutching her small suitcase, wearing the only formal coat she owned. She felt small, almost swallowed by the quiet grandeur of polished stone-high ceilings and art that belonged in museums rather than hallways. The staff had been polite but distant, well-trained in their roles, and accustomed to the demands of wealth. They taught her where to stand, where not to linger, how to move quietly, how to remain unobtrusive. It fit Clara's nature well. She never wanted to draw attention, but even on that first day she sensed that the house, despite its beauty, was strangely hollow, as though the walls remembered laughter but had forgotten how to echo it. She learned quickly that the source of that silence was Julian Whitmore himself. She saw him only in passing in those early weeks, glimpses of a tall man with tired eyes, shoulders weighed by invisible burdens, a face that looked carved by grief and discipline. He rarely spoke except when necessary. He rarely looked at anyone. There was something haunted about him, something that made the staff lower their voices when they mentioned his name. Clara never pried. She respected the boundaries of the lives she worked around. But she noticed things. She noticed the way Julian's steps slowed when he passed the long hallway lined with old trophies and photographs. She noticed how he avoided the rooms with sunlight. She noticed the faint tremor in his hands when he signed documents late at night, as though his body remembered pain even when his mind refused to acknowledge it. She also noticed the kindness he did not realize he showed, the way he never raised his voice at the staff, the way he paused before dismissing someone, allowing them the dignity of finishing their sentence, the way he always looked out the window before entering a room, as though searching for something he no longer believed existed. Clara felt something for him long before she understood it. Not admiration, not infatuation, certainly not the foolish kind of crush her friends used to giggle about. What she felt was recognition. Two people, shaped by loss. Two people who had learned to move through life with quiet resilience. And yet she never imagined he would notice her. She was just a maid, one more piece of the machinery that kept his estate running. She wore simple uniforms, tied her hair back neatly, kept her eyes lowered when appropriate. She never expected him to look beyond the surface. But sometimes when she walked past his office, she felt his gaze follow her, not with desire but with curiosity, as though he sensed something familiar in her that he had not yet found words for, and that unsettled her. Clara had survived by staying small, by not inviting attention, by protecting the soft parts of herself with silence. Julian Whitmore was the kind of man whose presence could swallow a person whole without meaning to. Yet she never felt fear around him. She felt something gentler, something like hope, though she would never have admitted it aloud. She began noticing his routines. The places he sat when he could not sleep. The way he lingered near the piano but never touched it. The times he stared at the photographs displayed throughout the estate, as though searching for a version of himself he had misplaced. Clara respected his distance. She respected the sorrow she sensed beneath the surface. But she also cared quietly and without expectation. She ironed his shirts with more patience than required. She left fresh flowers near the window he always paused at. She kept the house warm on nights she knew he barely slept. Little things, goodness in action, the kind of goodness her mother taught her to believe in, even when the world felt cold. And maybe that was why the moment she found him in the forbidden room during the storm hurt her heart in ways she could not explain. She realized then that he was not distant by choice but by damage. And something deep in her began to shift, though she did not yet understand that it was the beginning of a love she had never expected to feel. In the days that followed the storm, the mansion settled back into its usual rhythm, yet something in the air had changed with such quiet subtlety that no one but Clara and Julian seemed capable of feeling it. It lived in the pauses between footsteps, in the softened way their eyes drifted toward each other, and then away, in the fragile warmth that rose uninvited whenever they found themselves in the same room. Silence, once cold and heavy across the halls of Whitmore Estate, had become something else entirely, a language spoken only between two wounded souls who did not yet understand the vocabulary forming between them. Clara noticed the change first. She would enter the dining room to clear the morning dishes, and find Julian still sitting at the table long after he had finished his coffee, staring not at his reports or tablet, but at the light moving across the floor. He looked almost peaceful in those moments, though peace sat strangely on him like a coat he had forgotten how to wear. Whenever Clara approached, he did not speak, but he did not retreat either. Instead, he watched her with quiet acknowledgement, as though the simple presence of another human being had become both unfamiliar and unexpectedly grounding. She pretended not to notice, but her pulse betrayed her every time. She had never been observed this way before, not by someone who could see past her uniform, past her practiced composure, past the smallness she had learned to adopt in the presence of power. Julian saw her, not completely, not yet, but enough to make her careful steps feel less like routines and more like invitations to something she could not name. Julian felt the shift as well, though he tried to explain it away through logic. He told himself that the storm had disoriented him, that exhaustion had made him vulnerable, that Clara had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, when the past had dragged him under. And yet each time he saw her, something in him eased in a way he had not experienced in years. Her presence softened the edges of his silence, turning it from a hiding place into something closer to refuge. He found himself standing a little straighter when she walked by, his breath settling into a calmer rhythm without his permission. Her gentleness was quiet but powerful, a soft persistence that did not demand anything from him, yet somehow changed everything. Their interactions became a series of moments stitched together by unspoken truths. When Clara placed his files on the corner of his desk, her fingers brushed the wood with the kind of care most people reserved for fragile objects. Julian saw the intention in her movements, the mindfulness that drew a fine line between duty and grace. He found himself wanting to watch her longer to understand how someone so young carried such steadiness. But every time she sensed his gaze, she would lower her eyes in a way that was neither shy nor submissive but protective, as though meeting his eyes too directly might reveal something she was not ready to share. One afternoon she brought him tea because the coffee machine had broken, and when he looked at her in faint surprise, she simply said that warm drinks helped with tension. He tasted the tea, he tasted calm. Neither of them mentioned that he had slept only 4 hours the night before. Neither mentioned the storm or the forbidden room. Silence spoke for them. Silence said, "We remember." Silence said something changed. Clara began noticing patterns in his quiet. The silence he carried was not empty but layered, built from grief, pressure, and the weight of expectations that had shaped nearly every adult choice he had ever made. She sensed the loneliness beneath it, the kind that tightened around a person over time, not by choice but by circumstance. She recognized it because she had lived with her own version of it, the ache of being unseen in a world that rarely slowed down long enough to understand who she was beyond responsibility. In her presence, Julian's silence softened like ice cracking under the warmth of dawn. In his presence, Clara's silence deepened, not in fear but in awareness, because something inside her recognized the risk of caring for a man who stood so far above her world. But caring did not ask permission. It simply happened. The staff began to notice the subtle shift even if they did not comment on it directly. They noticed the way Clara walked more carefully around Julian's office, as if protecting the space from unnecessary noise. They noticed the way Julian no longer barked short instructions through closed doors, but instead stepped into the hallway to speak softly when she was nearby. They noticed the unfinished conversations that seemed to hover in the air, suspended between glances that lingered half a second longer than they should. Yet nothing inappropriate occurred, nothing that could be named or criticized. There were only small gestures, the kind that made people wonder but never assume. One particular morning, just after sunrise, Clara found Julian standing on the balcony outside his private study, a place he rarely visited during winter. Frost clung to the railing, his breath drifted into the cold air like a ghost escaping him. She stepped toward him quietly, intending only to leave a folded throw blanket at the door for when he went back inside. But he turned at the faint sound of her footsteps, his expression softer than she had ever seen. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither spoke. The silence between them thickened, not uncomfortable but charged, as though the world had narrowed to the space of a single breath. Then Julian offered the smallest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, and something else, something close to gratitude. Clara placed the blanket down and stepped back, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Despite the cold, she did not need words to understand what he was trying to say. Sometimes silence was enough. Sometimes silence said too much. Their lives intertwined not through grand moments but through these quiet exchanges, these fragile threads of presence and understanding that wove themselves into the routine of their days. Neither admitted they were slowly becoming something to each other. Neither dared. But sometimes, in the brief seconds where their eyes met before retreating, they felt the truth of it rise between them like breath fogging a window. Two wounded souls, learning the same language. A language spoken in glances and pauses. A language neither planned to speak but both were beginning to understand. The moment it happened was so ordinary that Julian almost missed it, a quiet intersection of their routines, on a late afternoon, when the estate felt softer than usual, touched by the pale winter light that filtered through the tall windows. Clara had finished her shift early because several of the senior staff had returned from their holiday break, and for once, she was free to wander through the estate's small library, a room most employees ignored because the Whitmores rarely used it. The space itself was not large but held a charm that reminded her of the school libraries she used to clean after hours in Montana, with soft lamps, shelves of weathered books, and a deep armchair tucked beneath a framed painting of a mountain valley. She had come only to return a novel she found abandoned in the laundry room, yet something in the stillness invited her to linger. With no one around to observe her, Clara sat in the armchair, tucked her legs beneath her, and opened an old book she pulled from the shelf. Its spine cracked, its pages slightly yellowed. It was not the kind of book she usually chose, but the opening line captured her, and soon she was lost in a world of ink and imagination. Her hair, no longer tied back in the neat bun required during work hours, fell in loose waves over her shoulders. Her uniform had been exchanged for a soft cream sweater and simple jeans, clothes she rarely wore because she spent most of her days dressed for service. She looked young, uncomplicated, herself in a way no one at the estate had seen before. She did not hear Julian's footsteps until he had already crossed the threshold, drawn by the faint glimmer of light beneath the door and the unexpected knowledge that someone was inside a room usually left untouched. He had come searching not for company but for solitude after a long meeting with the board, another tedious hour in which Victoria Hale pressed her opinions with the forceful confidence of someone convinced they were destined to lead. His head ached, his patience was thin, but the sight he stepped into dissolved all of that. Clara sat curled in the armchair, her face tilted slightly downward as she read, her expression open in a way he had never seen. The softer clothing, the loosened hair, the absence of her uniform, all of it shifted something in him. She did not notice his presence at first, and he found himself unable to speak, unwilling to break the fragile magic of the moment. Her innocence was not childish but luminous, as though she carried a quiet world inside her that she allowed no one to disturb. It struck him so deeply he forgot to breathe. When she finally sensed him, she looked up with a startled softness, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before she sat up straighter, almost as if preparing to apologize. He shook his head once, the slightest gesture, telling her she did not need to explain. But Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks anyway, an instinct she could not control. She stood holding the book to her chest. "I did not know anyone used this room anymore," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I do not," Julian replied, his tone surprisingly gentle, "but I am glad someone does." Clara hesitated, unsure whether she had overstepped, whether she should leave immediately. Yet Julian's gaze held no reprimand, no impatience, only curiosity. A curiosity she had never seen directed at her so openly. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book. She glanced down as though embarrassed by the simple story. She had chosen a romance about finding love in unlikely places. "Just something I picked up," she murmured. "Nothing important. If it matters to you, then it is important." The words escaped him before he could think them through, but when Clara's eyes met his, he felt a surprising jolt of truth in them. She gave a small, fragile smile. "I like stories where people find what they are afraid to hope for," she admitted. Perhaps because she was not wearing her uniform, perhaps because she appeared more like a young woman living a quiet life than an employee in his home. Julian saw her differently. He saw not the maid who moved silently through his halls, but a person with dreams she kept hidden, a person who believed in extraordinary things despite having lived a life filled with responsibility and restraint. It unsettled him. It moved him. He stepped farther into the room, and for the first time Clara did not retreat. Instead, she remained near the armchair, her fingers brushing the edge of the worn pages. "May I?" he asked, motioning toward the bookshelf behind her. She nodded. He scanned the titles, letting his eyes wander across volumes he had not touched since before Elena died. Books from a younger life, a younger version of himself who believed in narrative arcs and happy endings. "Do you read often?" he asked without turning toward her. "When I can," she said. "Books feel safe. They do not ask anything from you. They just let you feel something without consequences." Her honesty slipped out so naturally it surprised them both. Julian paused. His hand hovered over a spine he once knew well. "I used to read a lot," he said quietly. "Before." He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Clara understood. Some silences carried their own explanations. When he finally turned, he looked at her fully, truly, without the barrier of their roles. And for the first time he saw the girl she was beneath the uniform. Not a maid, not an employee, not someone orbiting the edges of his life. She was just Clara, young, beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, real. Her eyes, usually lowered in deference, met his, and held for a moment too long. Something fluttered inside her, something soft and frightening. She looked away, pressing the book closer to her chest. "I should get back to my duties," she whispered, even though no duties waited for her at that moment. He understood the instinct. Retreat was easier than confronting whatever flickered between them. "Thank you for not disturbing the room," he said softly. "And thank you for keeping the house warm these past weeks." It was the first time he had acknowledged her care. The first time he revealed he noticed her kindness at all. Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she walked past him toward the door, Julian felt a strange ache in his chest, a stirring he could not identify. When she reached the doorway, she paused, hesitating before looking back. "I am glad you like that room," she said softly. "It deserves someone who remembers it." Then she disappeared into the hallway, leaving Julian standing in the soft glow of the library lamps, feeling something unfamiliar rise in him. Longing. He had seen her not as part of the background of his life, but as someone whose presence changed the air around him. Someone whose gentleness reached places inside him he had believed were long dead. And, in that quiet moment, Julian realized he did not want to forget the sight of her in that armchair wrapped in soft light, reading a story about hope. For the first time in years he wished to witness a moment like that again. The night that changed everything began with a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to pause outside the tall windows of Whitmore Estate, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The storm had returned without warning, sweeping across the mountains, in thick bands of snow that blurred the landscape and muffled every sound. The generators flickered under the strain lights, dimming, until the house glowed in a soft amber haze that made every shadow appear deeper than it should. Clara finished her evening rounds earlier than usual. Most of the staff had gone home to avoid the worsening weather, leaving the estate quieter than she had ever seen it. She moved through the hallways with a lantern in hand, checking windows, securing curtains, making sure nothing rattled loose in the rising wind. She did not expect to pass the sitting room on her way back to the kitchen, nor did she expect the faint golden glow spilling from beneath the door. Curiosity tugged at her gently but persistently. She hesitated, then raised her hand and knocked lightly. No answer came. When she pushed the door open, she found Julian standing near the fireplace, a half-burned log glowing behind him like a quiet ember. He was dressed in a simple, dark sweater. Instead of his usual tailored clothing, his sleeves pushed up slightly, revealing forearms that carried the subtle tension of a man who had forgotten how to rest. His posture was rigid, but his eyes, when he turned toward her, were softened by the firelight. "The storm is getting worse," Clara said, holding the lantern a little higher. "The generators keep dimming. I thought you might want extra candles." She stepped farther inside, before she lost her nerve, and placed the lantern on the nearest table. Julian looked at her as though he wanted to speak but had not yet decided what truth to give shape to. Instead, he nodded and glanced toward the window. "I could feel the storm coming," he murmured. "It feels like the mountains are breathing." Clara followed his gaze. Snow swept across the glass in wild spirals, and the entire estate seemed wrapped inside a cocoon of white and wind. The world outside felt distant, unreachable. Julian turned back to the fire. "You should not be working this late with the weather like this." She smiled faintly, folding her hands in front of her. "I do not mind. Quiet nights never scare me." He studied her for a moment, a long, quiet observation that felt less like scrutiny and more like a question he did not know how to ask. Then the lights flickered again before fading completely. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the flickering fire and the small lantern Clara had brought. She reached for it instinctively, but Julian stepped closer and touched her hand gently to stop her. "Leave it," he said. "The fire is enough." His hand lingered for a second longer than intended, warm against her skin, and Clara felt the breath catch in her throat, not from fear, from awareness. They moved to the hearth without speaking, drawn by the glow that felt almost sacred in the sudden darkness. Clara sat on the rug near the fire, her knees tucked to one side. Julian hesitated before lowering himself beside her, leaving just enough space to preserve propriety, but not enough to dispel the quiet intimacy forming between them. The storm roared, but inside the room everything felt suspended, as though time itself had slowed to a gentle crawl. "I used to love nights like this," Julian said after a long stretch of silence. "They reminded me of the winters when I trained in the mountains." Clara watched him, her eyes soft. "Before the accident, before everything," he replied, his voice steady but carrying the weight of memory. He took a slow breath, staring into the fire. "There was a time when the world felt small enough to conquer, when youth felt endless, when tomorrow felt guaranteed. And then it changed," Clara whispered, not as a question but an understanding. He nodded. "Youth is not something you lose overnight. It is something that slips away quietly, while you are busy pretending you do not need hope anymore." Clara let his words settle between them. She had always sensed the heaviness he carried, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like being invited into a place he had kept locked for years. "What did you dream of before life changed?" she asked gently. Julian's gaze drifted upward, following the shadows dancing on the ceiling. "I dreamed of speed," he said with a faint smile. the kind of speed that makes you feel untouchable. I dreamed of competitions, medals, traveling the world, and after that, when the business became my life, I dreamed of creating something meaningful, helping people heal." He paused. "Then Elena died and I stopped dreaming at all." Clara felt her heart ache for him, not with pity but with a deep empathy she rarely experienced. "What did you love most about her?" she asked softly. Julian turned, surprised by the question, but the firelight softened his reaction. "She saw the best in me even when I could not. She believed I was capable of becoming more than just the version the world wanted." Clara looked down at her hands. "She must have loved you very much." "And I loved her," he said quietly but firmly. "But loss changes people. It reshapes the heart in ways you do not expect." She met his eyes again. "And now? Do you still feel broken?" Julian exhaled. "I feel unfinished." Like someone paused the story and forgot to press play again. Clara understood that feeling more than she admitted. They sat in a silence that was neither uncomfortable nor empty. Then Julian spoke again, his voice lower. "Clara, do you ever feel like life is asking you to be stronger than you were meant to be?" "All the time," she whispered. "Especially when you have someone to care for." "Your mother." "Yes. She is the reason I came here. The reason I keep going." "Responsibility can be a kind of love," Julian said. "Or a kind of burden," Clara added quietly. "Both," he agreed. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The fire crackled. Clara pulled the blanket from the back of the sofa and wrapped it around her legs. When Julian noticed, he shifted the blanket slightly, draping part of it across himself as well. It was such a simple gesture, yet the warmth that passed between them felt almost too tender for words. The closeness made Clara acutely aware of her own breathing, the soft rhythm of Julian's shoulder rising and falling near hers, the faint scent of pine and smoke that clung to his sweater. She had never shared such quiet intimacy with anyone before. It frightened her. It comforted her. Julian broke the silence again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "This night feels different." Clara turned toward him. "How?" "Because I am not hiding in it. I am sitting beside someone who makes it feel less lonely." Her breath caught slightly, but she held his gaze, feeling something inside her shift, like a door slowly opening. They talked for hours, sharing fears, regrets, dreams they had buried long ago. No secrets heavy enough to wound, but truths gentle enough to heal. The fire dimmed to embers, casting a soft red glow over their faces. At one point, Julian looked at her with an expression so raw that Clara felt the world tilt. She wondered if he would reach for her hand. He did not. She wondered if she would pull away if he did. She did not know. But nothing inappropriate happened. Nothing impulsive. Nothing that would betray the purity of the moment. Instead, they let the silence close around them again, filled not with distance but with the fragile beginnings of trust. When the storm finally softened near dawn, Julian leaned back against the sofa, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. Clara watched him for a long moment before whispering that he should sleep. He nodded but did not move. Not yet. Not until he looked at her once more, and said in a voice rough with honesty, "Tonight felt like remembering how to breathe." He closed his eyes, and Clara pulled the blanket gently over him, watching the harsh lines of his face ease into something peaceful. She did not touch him again. She did not need to. The night had already changed everything. Julian woke with a start, not because of a nightmare, nor because of the cold mountain air that crept in through the barely sealed windows, but because something inside him felt startlingly unfamiliar. For years he had risen each morning with a heaviness that clung to him, long before he opened his eyes, a weight that settled into his bones and made every movement feel like an effort. But on this morning, with the storm finally calmed, and the fire in the sitting room reduced to a soft glow, he felt something he could not immediately name. His body felt lighter, his mind clearer, the air easier to breathe. For several seconds he remained still, listening to the steady crackle of the cooling embers and the faint hum of generators coming back to life throughout the estate. His memory drifted back slowly, piecing together the fragments of the night before. The fire, the storm, the quiet, intimate conversation that had stretched across hours. Clara sitting beside him, her presence soft and steady, her voice gentle in ways that disarmed him more than any confession ever could. He remembered how her eyes had reflected the firelight, warm enough to illuminate parts of himself he had long believed dead. He had fallen asleep near her, a truth that would have once embarrassed him but now brought an unexpected calm. No nightmares had clawed at him. No grief had choked him awake. Just rest. Pure, unbroken rest. He stood slowly, stretching muscles that seemed less tense than usual, and brushed the faint ash from his sweater. When he glanced toward the blanket draped neatly over the arm of the sofa, he felt a stirring in his chest. Clara had covered him. Not because she had to, not because it was part of her duties, but because she cared. He had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for in such a simple, genuine way. As he stepped out of the sitting room, the early morning light filtered in through the tall windows of the east corridor. Snow blanketed the grounds in thick layers, untouched and shimmering like a fresh canvas, waiting for the first mark of a new day. Julian felt as though he himself were standing in front of a canvas, a blank expanse that dared him to begin again. Something inside him urged him forward, propelled by the rare sensation of energy rather than obligation. He found himself walking toward the kitchen, a place he rarely visited except out of necessity. The smell of coffee met him before he reached the doorway, rich and warm, filling the air with a quiet comfort. Clara stood near the counter, her back turned as she poured the steaming liquid into a mug. Her hair was tied back again, her uniform crisp and neat, but Julian saw her differently now. Perhaps it was because he had glimpsed the woman behind the uniform the night before. Perhaps it was because she had offered him something no one else had in years: unspoken understanding. Clara turned at the sound of his footsteps, surprise flickering across her features, before she composed herself. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "I made coffee since the machine is working again." Julian nodded and accepted the mug she handed him. His fingers brushed hers briefly, a touch so light it could have been accidental, yet both of them felt it too clearly to pretend it meant nothing. "Thank you," he said, taking a sip. The warmth spread through him, immediately grounding him. "You look well rested," she observed carefully. That was not something she had ever said to him before, but the truth of it was undeniable. "I am," he said slowly, almost testing the words as they left him. He felt himself searching for the right explanation, but none felt adequate. Instead, he looked at her, meeting her gaze fully. "Last night helped more than you know." Clara lowered her eyes, though a faint color rose in her cheeks. "I only listened," she whispered. "Sometimes that is enough." "More than enough," Julian replied. He did not elaborate, but the silence that followed was warm, not strained. After finishing his coffee, he found himself craving movement, an urge he had not felt in years. He stepped outside onto the back terrace, overlooking the snow-covered grounds. The cold air hit his face sharply, invigorating instead of punishing. He inhaled deeply, feeling something awaken inside him. Without thinking, he began walking down the stone steps. The crunch of fresh snow beneath his boots stirred an old memory, one of early morning training runs through mountain trails, when he had been younger, when the world felt limitless. A thought crossed his mind, hesitant at first but growing bolder. What if he tried running again? Not competitively, not the way he once did, but simply to feel alive, to reclaim a piece of himself he had abandoned. He hesitated only a moment. Then he began to jog. At first, his steps were slow and careful, muscles awakening from years of disuse, but as he continued, his pace steadied. His breath formed clouds in the frozen air, his heartbeat finding a rhythm he had not felt in years. It was not the speed of his youth, nor the effortless grace he once commanded, but it was movement, freedom, life. When he reached the far edge of the property, he stopped, hands on his knees, panting, exhilarated. His chest heaved, not with exhaustion but with something close to joy. He felt younger, not in body, not completely, but in spirit. He walked back toward the estate with shoulders lifted, steps lighter, and eyes brighter than they had been in more than a decade. Clara saw him returning from the window near the kitchen, and pressed her hands against her chest without meaning to. He moved differently. He looked different, as though some part of him had been restored during the night they had shared beside the fire. She met him outside the door, her breath catching when she saw the faint smile tugging at his lips. "You were running," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Yes," Julian replied. "And it felt good." There was something almost boyish in his expression, a spark she had never seen before, a spark he likely had forgotten he possessed. Clara smiled, despite herself, the warmth in her chest blooming with a quiet pride she did not dare voice. "I am glad," she said simply. Julian looked at her for a long moment, his breath still visible in the cold morning air. "Last night reminded me of something I thought I had lost," he admitted. She waited, not pressing him for meaning. "Myself," he finished softly. Clara felt her throat tighten because she knew exactly what it meant to lose pieces of yourself, and then find them again in unexpected places. The wind picked up lightly, brushing a strand of her hair across her cheek. Julian reached out without thinking, gently tucking it behind her ear before realizing what he had done. The touch was brief but charged enough to make both of them still. "I am sorry," he murmured, pulling his hand back. "Do not be," Clara whispered. Her eyes held his, wide and uncertain but honest. The silence that followed was fragile, delicate, filled with something neither dared to name. Julian exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "I should get ready for the board meeting," he said at last. Clara nodded and stepped back, her heart beating far too quickly. As he walked away, she realized with startling clarity that she had never seen him look so alive, and he realized with equal truth that he had never felt so young. The world inside Whitmore Estate had grown softer in the days following the storm, but the world outside had not changed at all. It remained sharp and watchful, full of people who measured power with cold precision and saw vulnerability as an inconvenience. Julian had almost forgotten that truth as he moved through his routines with a lighter spirit, unaware that others had begun to notice subtle shifts in him, changes that drew attention for reasons neither he nor Clara anticipated. It began with the staff who had never seen him linger so long in the kitchen on quiet mornings or walk the grounds with the faintest hint of a smile. Then, it spread to the board, who caught wind of his renewed energy during a virtual meeting and wondered what had sparked the sudden improvement. But no one questioned it directly until Victoria Hale arrived unannounced on a bright but brittle morning, her heels clicking sharply across the marble floors, her presence slicing through the peaceful rhythm the house had begun to adopt. Victoria was the kind of woman who appeared flawlessly assembled at all times, with sleek, blonde hair pulled into a perfect twist and eyes that assessed everything with strategic calculation. She stepped into the foyer as if she owned the entire mountain. Julian was not expecting her, which was precisely why she came. She enjoyed catching people off guard. It allowed her to see their unfiltered reactions, and today she wanted answers. She had heard whispers of Julian waking early, of him running again, of him smiling more than usual. To someone like her, who built her reputation on controlling narratives and shaping perceptions, such a shift was not comforting. It was alarming. She found Julian in his office, reviewing documents with a focus she had not seen in months. He looked healthier, more grounded, more like the man she once believed she could influence. Victoria forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You seem in good spirits, Julian. Has something changed?" Julian looked up slowly, knowing better than to respond casually. Victoria always wrapped her questions in silk, but her intentions were steel. "I am doing well," he replied evenly. "Nothing more than that." Victoria stepped closer, sliding into one of the chairs opposite his desk. Her coat draped elegantly across her arm, her perfume subtle but assertive. She studied him with an expression that pretended to be warm but revealed nothing but ambition. "The board is curious," she said. "You appear to be regaining momentum. Investors are pleased. It is good to see you back." Julian nodded, waiting for the real question. And it came. What triggered the change? The words were velvet but edged with suspicion. Julian's gaze did not waver, nothing specific, just clarity returning after a long winter. Victoria watched him carefully. He had always been good at hiding emotions, but she caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Something soft, something dangerous. Her instincts sharpened. "There is a rumor," she said lightly, as if it were inconsequential. "The staff say you have been spending more time around the house, walking, smiling, drinking coffee in the kitchen." The last comment slipped out with a hint of disdain. Julian did not respond. Victoria leaned forward. "Rumors can be concerning if left unexplained, especially when they involve certain employees." Her meaning settled into the room like a shadow. Julian's posture stiffened, his voice cooled. "Leave my staff out of your speculation." Victoria's smile thinned. "So there is something to speculate about." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The warning was clear in the stillness that followed. But Victoria was not someone who backed down easily. She stood smoothing her coat with slow deliberation. "You know how this works, Julian. Public perception matters. If investors feel uncertain about your judgment, the board may begin making decisions you will not like." Before he could reply, her gaze drifted toward the doorway. Clara walked past at that exact moment, holding a tray of linens, unaware that she had stepped into the center of something she could not see. Victoria's expression shifted instantly. Her eyes narrowed, assessing Clara, as though she were a misplaced object in an otherwise perfect room. Clara paused, startled by the intense gaze, and offered a polite nod before continuing down the hall. The silence that followed weighed heavy. Victoria turned back to Julian with a slow, poisonous smile. "Interesting," she murmured. "Very interesting." Julian's jaw tightened. Enough. But Victoria had already gathered what she came for. Not evidence, not proof, just suspicion. And for someone with her influence, suspicion was fuel. The rest of the day moved in uneasy fragments. The staff whispered about the tension that radiated through the halls like static. Julian retreated into long meetings trying to maintain control of the company's shifting dynamics. But Clara felt the shift most acutely. She sensed the change when she passed Victoria again near the library. The woman looked at her with a mixture of amusement and cold disdain, as though she had already decided who Clara was, without knowing a single truth about her. Later that afternoon, Clara overheard two housekeepers whispering near the service corridor. They said Victoria had been asking questions. They said she was known for destroying those who threatened her position. Clara's stomach knotted. Not because she feared for herself, but because she feared for what this could mean for Julian. She never wanted to be a source of trouble in his life. She had worked too hard to blend into the edges, to stay invisible enough to avoid complications. But invisibility was no longer possible. Not when the world had begun to notice what they should not have seen. Julian came downstairs in the early evening, his expression tense but controlled. He found Clara in the main hallway, adjusting the flowers in a vase, because she needed something to steady her hands. "Clara," he said softly, and she turned, her eyes lifting to his with the same quiet sincerity that had undone him in the storm. "How much did you hear today?" he asked. "Enough to know someone is angry with me for reasons I do not understand," she replied gently. He stepped closer. "This is not your fault. But it could become your burden," she whispered. "People like her do not need proof. They only need someone to blame." Julian's chest tightened. Her words held a truth he hated. The world had seen something between them, something unnamed but undeniable, and it was already beginning to twist it into something dangerous. Victoria had planted the seed. The rest of the world would water it. And neither of them was ready for the storm that would follow. Clara had always believed that love in its truest form was not something loud or possessive or selfish. Love was sacrifice. Love was choosing someone else's well-being, even when it tore you apart. She never thought she would learn that truth in a mansion overlooking the frozen mountains of Aspen, and certainly not because of a man whose world existed so far above her own that even dreaming of him felt like stepping out of bounds. Yet as whispers spread through the estate, and the air thickened with suspicion, she realized that her presence in Julian's life had become a danger he did not deserve. It began quietly with glances from staff that were not unkind but heavy with worry, as though they knew something awful was gathering on the horizon. Then came the meeting Clara accidentally overheard while bringing documents to the study. Julian's voice, usually measured, held an edge she had never heard before. Victoria's tone, cold and triumphant, sliced through the air. "Your attachment to certain employees is being noticed, Julian. Investors are loyal until they sense instability, and right now they sense it everywhere." Julian replied sharply, "If you are implying that I am incapable of leading because I treat my staff with basic humanity, then perhaps the investors should question what values they expect from us." Victoria laughed softly, the sound like frost cracking. "Do not pretend this is about kindness. You and I both know where the whispers are pointing. You and the maid." Julian's silence was immediate, furious. Clara pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she felt it might bruise her ribs. Victoria lowered her voice, each word dripping with calculated threat. "You are risking everything, Julian. Your legacy, your control of the company. And for what? A girl who does not belong in this world, a girl who will ruin you simply by standing too close." Clara fled before she could hear more, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the stack of files she carried. The rest of the day unfolded like a slow ache. Staff avoided meeting her eyes. Victoria passed her twice, with a smirk that cut deeper than words. And Julian, though trying to act as if nothing had changed, carried a tension in his shoulders that only confirmed what Clara already knew: she had become the crack through which the world would try to shatter him. She could not let that happen. She would not. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains and bathed the snow in pale rose light, Clara entered the foyer to find Julian waiting for her. His expression told her he already sensed the distance growing between them. "Clara," he said softly, "we need to talk." She folded her hands in front of her to keep them from shaking. "I know." He stepped closer, searching her face. "You heard something today, did you not?" She did not trust herself to speak, so she nodded. Julian exhaled the breath, almost a sigh. "I am sorry. None of this should have touched you." She shook her head. "You cannot protect me from people like her. And you should not have to." He frowned. "Clara, listen to me. This has nothing to do with you. This is the board trying to manipulate a narrative they think benefits them. You did nothing wrong, but that was the tragedy of it. She could do everything right and still bring ruin to him, simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong feelings in her heart. She swallowed hard. I do not want to be the reason people question your leadership. You are not, he insisted, his voice firm, but she could see in his eyes the shadow of doubt he was trying so hard to hide. It was not doubt in her. It was doubt in the vicious world that surrounded him. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. Julian, people like me are invisible until the world decides to weaponize us. And now they have. Victoria will not stop until she gets what she wants. Julian's jaw tightened. I will handle Victoria. You should not have to handle anyone because of me. The words escaped before she could stop them, and the moment they hung between them she realized they were the truest thing she had ever said. Julian stepped closer, his voice softer. Clara, please do not pull away. Last night, these past days, they have meant more to me than I know how to explain. Something in her chest cracked. She wished she could be selfish. She wished she could stay. But love was not selfish, and staying would destroy him. She reached for courage she did not feel. I have written a letter, she whispered. His breath caught. Clara. Her voice trembled as she continued. You gave me a night I will remember forever. A night where you let yourself be human again. But you deserve a life the world will not punish you for. And I cannot be part of that world. Not without hurting you. Julian stared at her, stunned grief slicing through every guarded layer he kept around himself. You are not hurting me, he said fiercely. Being near you has healed more than you know. But the world sees things differently, she whispered. And I cannot be the reason they take everything from you. Something desperate flickered in Julian's eyes, something raw and terrified of losing the first warmth he had felt in years. Clara, do not do this. Not like this. For the first time since she met him, she had to look away because his eyes felt like pleas she was too weak to withstand. I am doing this because I care for you, she said, her voice breaking. And because caring for you means choosing what protects you, not what I want. He stepped forward as if to reach for her, but stopped himself, his restraint agonizing. When do you leave? He asked, his voice low. Tonight, she whispered. Before anyone else wakes. Before I lose my resolve. Julian closed his eyes, and Clara felt the full weight of what she was doing carving into her with every heartbeat. She wished he would order her to stay. She wished he would demand something unreasonable so she could pretend she had no choice but to remain. But Julian Whitmore did not take choices from people. Instead, he opened his eyes and said the words that broke her completely. If leaving keeps you safe, I will not stop you. But please understand this. Nothing about you has ever ruined me. You brought me back to life. Clara bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice, and then turned away before she shattered entirely. She left the estate under the cover of darkness, snow falling gently as if trying to soften the moment. With every step her heart cracked further, but she kept walking. Because love, real love, sometimes meant walking away so the person you cared for could remain whole. She never looked back, because if she did, she knew she would never leave. Julian had endured loss before. He had weathered grief so deep it hollowed him out, survived betrayal from business partners who mistook his kindness for weakness, and outlasted competitors who believed he would crumble under pressure. But nothing prepared him for the collapse that followed Clara's departure. When he woke the next morning and found her room empty, her uniform folded neatly on the bed, and her small collection of belongings gone, a silence, unlike anything he had ever known, filled the estate. Not the cold silence of loneliness. Not the bitter silence of regret. This was the silence of absence, the kind that pressed against the ribs like a bruise, reminding him with every breath that something essential had been removed from his life. He walked through the hallways in a daze, pausing at the places where he had grown used to seeing her. The kitchen where she made coffee in the early morning, the library where she sat curled in that armchair lost in her books, the sitting room where they had shared a night that had lifted years of darkness from his shoulders. Everywhere he looked, something was missing. Her presence, though always gentle and small, had filled the estate like warmth fills a home. Without her, the house returned to its old state, echoing with emptiness. Julian knew he could not afford to fall apart, not now, not with the board already watching him with predatory interest. But grief is not logical, and loss does not wait for convenient moments. He attended a morning meeting with the board, only hours after discovering Clara was gone, and every member noticed the strain etched into his features. Victoria noticed most of all. She entered the conference room with a confidence sharpened by Clara's absence, sensing weakness the way a wolf senses opportunity. Julian, she said in a tone dripping with false concern, you seem distracted. "Is everything all right at the estate?" His jaw tightened. "Everything is fine." Victoria lifted an eyebrow. "Good. Because the investors are asking questions. There are rumors about impropriety with an employee, and although I assured them there was nothing of substance, uncertainty can be dangerous." Julian kept his composure, but the room felt suddenly colder. He had expected resistance from the board, but he did not anticipate how quickly they would twist Clara's departure into ammunition. "Our stock has dipped 2 points," another board member added. "Investors want stability, Julian. They want leadership that is not influenced by personal entanglements." Entanglements. The word struck him like a blow. Clara was not an entanglement. She was the only person in years who had made him feel alive. But he could not defend her without proving their suspicions. He forced himself to focus on the presentation, pushing through the meeting with the discipline of a man accustomed to swallowing pain. Yet despite his effort, cracks showed. His usually sharp responses were slower, his strategic clarity faltered. His voice carried a strain he could not mask. By the time the meeting ended, the board had reached a silent conclusion. Julian Whitmore was slipping. And for some of them, that was exactly what they wanted. Later that day, news articles appeared online, subtle at first, but unmistakably targeted. Headlines speculated about instability in Whitmore Innovations, unnamed sources hinted at internal conflicts, and one particularly venomous piece suggested that Julian's personal life had begun to interfere with his ability to lead. Victoria watched the media storm grow with thinly veiled satisfaction. Clara's absence had given her leverage, and she intended to use it. Meanwhile, Julian tried to bury himself in work, hoping order could drown out the chaos inside him. But every email he wrote, every report he read, every conversation he forced himself through, felt heavy and hollow. His concentration fractured. His temper grew short. His nights became long stretches of sleepless hours spent staring at the fireplace, remembering the sound of Clara's voice as she spoke softly beside him. For a man who had only just begun to breathe freely again, the loss was suffocating. One evening, after a particularly brutal meeting where the board questioned his judgment so aggressively, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. Julian found himself standing alone in the forbidden room. The room where Clara had first found him during the storm. The room of his past. The photographs he had not burned still lay scattered across the floor. He knelt, picking one up. It showed him at 24, smiling with a fearlessness he no longer recognized. He wondered what that young man would think of him now, a version of himself, older but not wiser, powerful but not whole. "You were stronger once," he whispered to the empty room. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Strength had never been his problem. His problem was that he had forgotten why he wanted to live. Clara had reminded him, and now she was gone. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Julian straightened as his assistant stepped inside, her expression tense. "Sir," she said gently, "the board has called an emergency vote. They want to temporarily suspend your decision-making authority until they can evaluate your recent behavior." Julian felt the words land like stones inside his chest. The room tilted around him, suspended, stripped of control, reduced. Not because he was incapable, but because he had dared to feel something again. He dismissed his assistant with a quiet nod and closed the door. For a moment he simply stood there, allowing the reality to settle. The board was moving against him. The company he had built, the empire he had sustained through loss and pain, was slipping away. And Clara, the one person who had helped him remember his own worth, was gone, because she believed losing her was the only way to save him. He braced a hand against the wall, his breath unsteady. He had learned to stand again only days ago, and already the world had knocked him back to his knees. But grief carried a strange clarity, and as he lifted his gaze from the scattered photographs, he understood something he had never admitted before. He did not want the company without himself intact. He did not want power without humanity. He did not want a future if it required living like a ghost. He wanted Clara. He wanted the life he had glimpsed in moments beside her. And losing everything else no longer frightened him as much as losing her had. The day of the press conference dawned with a cold stillness that seemed to settle over the entire estate, a quiet warning that something irreversible was about to unfold. Julian had not slept. He had spent the night pacing the floors of his once comforting home, replaying memories that both strengthened and broke him. Clara's last look, full of quiet courage and heartbreaking resolve. The board's vote to suspend his authority. The relentless articles spreading through the media, like frost over glass, each one twisting the truth, each one reducing him to a scandal rather than a man. He had built an empire with discipline and sacrifice, honored his family legacy, weathered storms personal and professional. But none of it mattered if he could not recognize himself in the mirror. That was the thought that finally brought him clarity. By the time he stepped into the black car waiting outside the estate, he knew exactly what he was going to do. The conference hall in downtown Denver buzzed with reporters, investors, board members, and cameras perched like predatory birds waiting for him to falter. Victoria Hale stood near the podium in a tailored suit, her smile polished and triumphant, the kind of smile people wore when they believed they had already won. As Julian entered, conversations hushed. He walked with steady steps, though his heart thudded like a quiet drum beneath his ribs. His assistant whispered updates into his ear, but he barely heard them. His focus narrowed to the single truth that had crystallized overnight: the man the world expected him to be no longer existed. He was not here to defend an image. He was here to reclaim himself. The board members took their seats. Victoria approached him with a sympathetic tilt of her head that did not fool him for a second. "Julian," she said in a low voice, "this is your chance to regain control. If you stick to the statement we prepared, investors may reconsider your suspension." His expression remained unreadable. "Thank you, Victoria." Her smile widened, thinking she had him. But she did not know what he planned. The room fell silent as Julian stepped up to the podium, cameras flashing in rapid bursts. He rested both hands on the edges of the stand, grounding himself, gathering strength from the memory of Clara's quiet belief in him. "Good morning," he began, his voice even stronger than he expected. "Thank you all for being here. There has been speculation about my leadership recently, and I intend to address it directly." Victoria folded her arms with a victorious tilt, ready to hear him fall in line. The board members leaned forward. Investors waited, some impatient, others cautiously hopeful. Julian took a breath. "I have spent years leading Whitmore Innovations with dedication, integrity, and resilience," he said. "I have faced challenges that tested every part of me, but the truth is simple: I am human." A ripple went through the audience. Journalists lifted their pens. Victoria stiffened. "For years I believed that vulnerability made me unfit to lead," he continued. "That grief had weakened me, that my past had stolen my future. I was wrong. Vulnerability is not a flaw. It is a reminder of who we are beneath the titles and expectations." The murmurs grew louder. This was not the speech the board had prepared. This was not the narrative Victoria wanted. Julian looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, many stunned. "Recently, rumors have circulated about my personal life, implying inappropriate involvement with an employee." Clara's name was not spoken aloud, but it echoed through the room nonetheless. Julian let the silence stretch. Then he delivered the sentence that would reshape the narrative in one stroke. "I will not allow a narrative that punishes a woman for reminding me I am human." Reporters gasped. Cameras flashed like lightning. Victoria's expression curdled, her composure slipping for the first time. Julian continued unshaken. "There is nothing inappropriate about kindness, nothing unprofessional about empathy, and nothing shameful about connecting with someone who sees you beyond your role. What is shameful is allowing fear to dictate how we treat others." His voice grew stronger, steady with conviction. "I will not participate in a system that destroys good people simply because their existence challenges the image of invincibility we pretend leaders must uphold." A wave of whispers rolled through the crowd. Some board members stared wide-eyed. Others sank lower in their chairs. Julian knew he was burning bridges, but he also knew this was the first time in years he felt truly in control. "The truth is this," he said. "I am not ashamed of feeling alive again. I am not ashamed of remembering what hope feels like. And no woman should be punished for reminding me I am human." With that final line, the room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras snapped relentlessly. Some investors looked furious. Others looked deeply moved. And then Victoria stepped forward, attempting to salvage the narrative. "Are you admitting, Julian, that you compromised the integrity of your position?" Her voice sliced through the noise. The room hushed. Julian faced her. "No," he said. "I am admitting that compassion is not a compromise. And if this company cannot understand that, then perhaps I am no longer the right man to lead it." A collective gasp swept through the hall. Victoria blanched, realizing too late that she had cornered a man with nothing left to fear. Julian stepped away from the podium. "I resign as acting head of day-to-day operations, effective immediately." Another shockwave rippled across the room. He continued walking as reporters surged toward him, shouting questions that blurred into a chaotic chorus. He did not answer. He simply left the hall, shoulders straight, head high, breathing air that felt freer than anything he had tasted in years. Outside, snow drifted gently across the steps of the building. Julian paused, lifting his face to the cold air. He had lost power. He had surrendered control. But in doing so, he had chosen something greater. He had chosen truth. He had chosen himself. And most of all, he had chosen Clara. The small Montana town where Clara had been born was the kind of place that did not appear on most maps. A quiet stretch of land where the mountains softened into rolling fields, and where winters arrived early and lingered long after spring should have softened the earth. It was here, in this unassuming corner of the world, that Julian Whitmore found himself driving a rented SUV along a cracked 2-lane road, the scent of pine drifting through the slightly open window. He had left Denver the morning after the press conference, leaving behind the echo of flashing cameras and the tidal wave of headlines he had knowingly unleashed. He did not regret a single word he had spoken. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, no longer bound to an image of strength that had isolated him for so long. But freedom meant little without the person who had taught him how to feel alive again. The sun was low by the time he neared Clara's hometown, casting long shadows across the empty road. He felt strangely nervous, an emotion he had not felt since boyhood, when he used to wait at the starting line of a competition, uncertain but ready. That same blend of hope and fear now thudded through his chest as he followed the directions Clara's friend had given him when he called earlier, with a mixture of humility and determination. She had been hesitant at first, as though unsure whether to trust him, but when he told her simply that he wanted to make sure Clara was safe, her voice softened. "She needs kindness right now," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." It was not until he turned onto a narrow gravel driveway lined with aging cottonwoods that he felt his breath catch. A small house stood at the end, its paint faded, its porch sagging slightly, but warm light glowed from the front window. It was a modest home, but it radiated something Whitmore Estate never had. It radiated life. Julian parked and stepped out his shoes, crunching lightly against the frost-kissed gravel. He approached the front door slowly, not wanting to startle anyone, not wanting to intrude. He lifted his hand to knock, but before his knuckles touched the wood, the door opened. Clara stood there. She was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back loosely, her expression startled but not fearful. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cold air swirled between them, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and winter pine. Julian felt every word he had rehearsed scatter inside his mind. Clara's breath trembled visibly as her eyes searched his face, as though unable to decide whether she was dreaming or facing something she had prayed would not come. She stepped back slightly, her hand gripping the doorframe. "Julian," she whispered, her voice both fragile and steady, "what are you doing here?" He swallowed, trying to gather the right words. "I came to find you. To make sure you were safe. To tell you something important." Her eyes darkened with concern. "You should not be here. People will twist this too. They already have." "They already will," he replied quietly. "But I am done living a life shaped by fear." Clara shook her head, her heart pounding. "Julian, you resigned. Everyone is talking about it. They say you lost your position. They say you burned your future." "I did not burn it," he said, stepping closer. "I chose it. And I chose to stop letting the world decide what my life should look like." She stared at him, as though seeing him for the first time in a different light, a man no longer carrying the weight of an empire but standing simply as himself. She opened the door wider. "Come inside. You are freezing." The warmth of the small house enveloped him as he stepped in. The faint crackle of a heater, the scent of soup simmering on the stove, the signs of a home lived in with tenderness rather than wealth. Clara motioned for him to sit at the small kitchen table, but she did not sit herself. She stood near the counter, her hands clasped tightly, her shoulders tense. "You should not have come," she said softly. "I left to protect you." Julian met her gaze with quiet certainty. "And I came because losing you showed me something I had forgotten. You are not my weakness, Clara. You are the only thing that has made me feel strong in years." Her breath caught. "You do not mean that. You are just overwhelmed. You walked away from everything you built." He shook his head. "No. I walked away from the parts of my life that were killing me. And now I am trying to walk towards something that feels real. Something that matters." Her voice cracked in fear. "Julian, I cannot be the reason your life falls apart. But you are the reason it started coming back together," he said gently. "The firelight that night. The conversation. The way you saw me when I could not see myself. You pulled me out of a place I had been trapped in for years. That is not something I can ignore." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she turned away quickly, wiping it with the back of her hand. He rose from his seat, moving toward her slowly, not wanting to overwhelm her. When he stood a foot away, she finally met his eyes. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could have anyone. All your life you have been surrounded by extraordinary people. Why choose someone like me?" "Because you do not want anything from me," Julian said softly. "Because you see the man behind everything. Because you speak to me like I am human. And because for the first time in a very long time I want to be worthy of someone's faith." Clara inhaled shakily. "My life is simple, complicated in other ways. My mother is sick. I work constantly. I cannot offer you the world. I do not want the world, Clara. I want a place where I'm not a title, a place where youth does not mean age but meaning, a place where hope exists." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "And that place is wherever you are." She pressed a hand to her chest as if steadying her heart. "You do not understand what you are saying. We are different. Our lives are different. Our worlds are different." Julian stepped closer. "Worlds can change. People can choose. And I am choosing you." Her breath trembled with shock and longing. He lifted a hand slowly, waiting for her to pull away. She did not. When his fingertips brushed her cheek, the warmth of her skin felt like something sacred. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for a brief, fragile moment. "Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I do not know how to do this." "Neither do I," he said, "but I know what it feels like to lose you. And I refuse to feel that again without fighting for something better." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, fully searching him for truth. "What do you want from me, Julian?" "Nothing," he said. "Only that you stay if you want to. Only that you let me stay if you will have me." Clara exhaled a trembling breath, her heart softening under the sincerity in his eyes. She stepped forward. For the first time since leaving Aspen, she let herself hope. And as Julian pulled her gently into his arms, she realized that maybe youth was not something a person lost, but something they rediscovered in the presence of someone who helped them breathe again. 1 year later, Julian Whitmore stood on the back porch of the small Montana house that had become his refuge, his anchor, and his quiet salvation. The early summer air drifted across the fields, carrying the scent of wild grass, and the distant hum of farm equipment, a far cry from the cold gleam of shareholder meetings and the relentless buzz of city life. Here, the world moved slowly in a rhythm he had never known before, a rhythm he had learned to appreciate, alongside the woman who had unknowingly rebuilt him. Clara stepped outside with 2 mugs of tea, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression soft and warm in the golden morning light. She handed him a mug, her fingers brushing his with a familiarity that still made his heart tighten in a way he had once believed impossible. "You were up early," she murmured. "Habit," he said with a gentle smile. "But I like waking up here." She leaned on the railing beside him, looking out at the field where her mother sat in a chair in the shade, wrapped in a blanket, watching the birds gather along the fence. Her mother's health had stabilized with new treatments Julian helped arrange, not with extravagance, but with compassion and access she had never been offered before. Clara did not resent his involvement. She understood that generosity was his truest language, not a transaction but an instinct. Inside the house, Clara's textbooks were stacked neatly on the table. She had enrolled in a nursing program at the local college, still working part-time, but no longer carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders alone. Julian supported her without fanfare, cooking dinners when she studied late, driving her to early classes, preparing flashcards she laughed at because his handwriting was terrible. He had never imagined a life like this, simple in its structure, profound in its meaning. He no longer woke with the pressure of an empire resting on his chest. He no longer measured his worth through productivity or quarterly reports. He measured it by mornings like this, by quiet conversations, by the feeling of Clara's hand in his when nothing needed to be said at all. He sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through him. "You know," he said after a moment, "I do not think about age anymore." She looked at him, amused. "That is because you stopped counting." He nodded, not embarrassed. When she arrived in his life, he had been weighed down by years that felt heavier than they should have. He had lived with the ache of old grief, old regret, old expectations, but Clara had shown him that age could be measured differently. Not by years, but by moments of renewal, by second chances, by rediscovered hope. She rested her head on his shoulder, her voice a soft whisper. "You seem younger now." He laughed quietly. "I feel younger, not in the way I used to define youth, not strength or speed or ambition, but something better, being able to look forward instead of back." She slipped her hand into his, their fingers weaving together with practiced ease. "I feel it too," she said. "Like life did not end before it began. Like we get to choose how it unfolds." He turned to her, then studying the woman who had once believed she had nothing to offer someone like him, unaware that she had given him everything he had not known he was missing. "Clara," he said gently, "you gave me back time. Not the years I lost, but the life I stopped living." She smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. "And you gave me safety, and space to breathe, and a reason to believe that love does not have to hurt." They stood together in peaceful silence, watching the horizon shift colors as the sun climbed higher. It was not a grand life by traditional standards, no galas, no press, no empires, but it was theirs. A life built not on spectacle but on presence, on healing, on choosing each other in the quiet moments. Behind them, through the open door, Julian could see the small foundation office he had set up in the spare bedroom, a modest operation dedicated to supporting rehabilitation programs in honor of his late wife. Clara had helped him design it, balancing tribute with forward motion. It was not a monument to grief, it was a promise to keep helping others find their way back to themselves. Clara squeezed his hand gently. "Do you ever miss your old life?" He thought for a moment. "Parts of it maybe, the excitement, the challenge, but I do not miss the wait. I do not miss the loneliness. And I do not miss pretending." She nodded. "I do not miss pretending either." He kissed the top of her head softly. "You never pretended. That was what saved me." She lifted her face, eyes shining with affection and certainty. "You saved yourself, Julian. I just reminded you that you were worth saving." He felt that truth settle inside him, warm and steady. The years behind him no longer felt like chains. The years ahead no longer felt like shadows. He no longer counted his age because age no longer defined him. What defined him now was this life, this woman, this quiet hope. Clara placed a hand on his chest, right over his heartbeat, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are not old, Julian. You just needed a reason to begin again." He covered her hand with his own, holding it there, as though anchoring the words, letting them settle into the deepest parts of him. And he knew without doubt that she was right. Life had not ended when the world told him it should. It had begun the night she walked into the room. No one was allowed to enter, and saw him not as a billionaire or a broken man, but as someone who still had something left to live for. "Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you are here right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart, whether it was Clara's quiet strength, Julian's fight to reclaim his humanity, or the reminder that sometimes the most powerful kind of love is the one that gently brings us back to ourselves." Stories like this live not just in their characters but in the people who read them, in the moments you recognize a piece of your own longing or hope reflected in someone else's struggle. So, before you go, I want to ask you something important, something we ask at the end of every story, because your voice shapes this community more than you might realize. First, tell me where in the world you are watching or reading from. It is always incredible to see how stories travel from country to country, from city to city, connecting people who may never meet, but who share the same desire for warmth, redemption, and love that does not break you but builds you. Whether you are in the heart of New York, the quiet hills of Tennessee, the wide plains of Montana, or somewhere far across the ocean, let us know. It brings this channel to life. Next, share your favorite moment in this story. Was it the night Clara and Julian sat by the fire in the storm, speaking truths they had never told another soul? Was it the morning he smiled again for the first time in years? Was it the press conference where he chose humanity over power? Or was it the quiet moment in Montana when he told her he wanted nothing from her except the chance to stay? Your reflections help us understand what resonates most deeply with you, and what kind of emotional journeys you want this channel to create next. And if this story meant something to you, if it brought you comfort or hope, or simply made you feel a little less alone today, consider leaving a comment that tells us why. Your words help lift this channel higher, and help others find these stories when they need them most. Now, I want to hear from you directly. On a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Be honest, be open. Your feedback helps shape the future of the channel, and pushes us to keep raising the quality of each new story. If you would rate it a 9 or 10, tell us what made it so meaningful. If your rating is lower, share what you felt was missing, what you wish had been explored more deeply, or what you hope to see in the next story. This community thrives on open conversation, and every voice matters here. And finally, if you want more stories like this one, stories about love that heals rather than harms, about billionaires who rediscover their hearts, about women whose quiet strength changes everything, then make sure you follow this channel. We post new stories regularly, each one crafted with the same care, emotion, and depth you experienced here. Hit that follow button so you never miss a new journey, a new heart to root for, a new ending that reminds you why love, even when fragile, is worth fighting for. Before you scroll away, take a moment to tell us one last thing. What kind of romance should we explore next? A single dad rebuilding his world? A grumpy CEO falling for the one woman he should not? A small-town girl facing the rich family that once broke her? Or something entirely different? Your ideas help spark new stories, and your imagination guides the direction of where we go. So, do not be shy. Leave a comment. Join the community. Your voice matters here, and your presence keeps these stories alive.